start the recording. All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to the second semester of the Classics and Ancient History Research Seminar at Newcastle. Well, in the name of Joe Skinner and myself, it's wonderful to see you all here. It's hopefully wonderful also to have an online audience for this. We have a very exciting program for this semester, and we have an equally exciting starting paper for our semester. And our guest tonight is Elena Giusti from Warwick. She has been an assistant professor in Latin literature and language at Warwick since 2017. And I'm sure that most of you are familiar with her very exciting work. And there's a very long list of both existing and forthcoming really exciting work on her webpage. Her first monograph is entitled Carthage in Virgil's Aeneid, Staging the Enemy under Augustus, and she continues to work on Carthage and the Aeneid in both of her new projects. She's currently working on a book on Virgil's Dido and her reception, entitled Dido of Carthage, forthcoming with Bloomsbury, as well as a commentary on Aeneid 5. She says on her webpage that she's planning 2 other monographs, one on the fictional imagery of Africa in Latin literary texts, and then also on silence and oblique illusion and how they foster ancient and modern conspiratorial readings in Augustan poetry. So lots of interesting thoughts here, lots of very interesting work that, of course, connects with very many discussions that we have in our modern life as well. And this, in fact, is another aspect of her work that she's writing about ideology critique, post-colonial studies, and also feminist theories in the context of a very long list of scholarly articles, but also in the context of podcasts and public engagement articles. Just last year saw the publication of an edited volume together with Tom Goye on absence in Latin literature and its reception. And she has no fewer than 3 other edited or co-edited volumes forthcoming. One is the Cambridge Companion to Classics and Race, one on the Vitruvian Man, and one on Virgil and the Feminine. So lots of exciting things to read from her already, lots of even more exciting things to come. So I'm sure that we'll have a very interesting paper and a really interesting discussion afterwards. And it's wonderful, Elena, that you're joining us for this first paper of the semester. And Elena's paper tonight is entitled Lucan's Magico-Medical Psylli. So the floor is yours, Elena, and we're very much looking forward to your paper.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Anke, for this introduction, and also thank you, and Joe, for the invitation. And I'm glad to be here, even virtually. I'll try to share my screen again, which it worked. Okay, so you remembered it. So that's great. So you should just see the slide. So yeah, I think this is the second time that I present in Newcastle, and it's the second time that I present on Lucan. I don't know if I think that Lucan is appropriate. I mean, the kind of post-Virgilian epic. There's a lot of expertise there, so it makes sense for me to get feedback on this. It's a little bit out of my comfort zone, I must say, but so I'm just looking forward to hearing what you think about this. So this is actually a chapter that I was very kindly invited to contribute to a volume edited by Chiara Blanco, Allegra Ann, and Simona Martorana that is called Body and Medicine in Latin Poetry, and it's been edited for De Gruyter as part of Trends in Classics. And so I've written this a while ago, but I've never presented it. And I'm really interested to hear what you have to say about it. So it kind of has this bend towards the theme of body and medicine and Latin poetry, but it also connects to my general interest in fictional representations of Africa. So I was already looking at the Psylli from that point of view. And I've written elsewhere about Lucan and Caesarism. So I kind of combine these 3 different strands of the paper in here, and I hope it makes some sense. So Lucan's Bellum Civile is frequently described as an epic of dismemberment, The metaphorical disintegration of the social tissues comprising the body politic of Republican Rome finds its gruesome application in the piling up of torn, mutilated, wide open bodies and corpses that throughout the epic challenge the very ontology of the human body as the site of conscience and subjectivity. And critics such as Shadi Barsh, John Anderson, Jamie Master, or Martin Dinter, to name a few, have repeatedly emphasized how the twists, gaps, ruptures, and boundary violations of Lucan's hexameters reflect in turn this rhetoric of laceration. But perhaps nowhere does Lucan showcase the dissolution of the human body more violently than in the march of Cato and his soldiers, the so-called Party of Libertas, as Lucan calls it after the death of Pompey, Partes Libertatis, through the snake-infested Libyan desert. Now, this is the very last fighting scene of the poem as we have it, and it marks the climax in the massacre of the Republican forces. As Shadi Barsh notes when commenting on Lucan's description of the death of Sabellus, the whole purpose of the reptilian onslaught seems to be nothing other than a graphic illustration of the physical disintegration of human limits, the metamorphosis of man into nothing but their own viscera and blood. Following the bite of a tiny seps, Sabellus's entire skin breaks up so quickly, you can see in line 668, fugit rupta cutis, that the man metamorphoses into a naked wound with no body, nudum sine corpore vulnus. And this is likely to be an allusion to Marcius in Ovid's Metamorphoses, which itself is the classic text for distorting and stretching bodily boundaries. As Ovid says of Marcius, that he was nothing but wound, nec quicquam nisi vulnus erat. Sabellus's limbs float in the poisoned blood in 770, membra natant saniae, until the venom boils them down and the bowels have flown out of the groin. Sabellus himself becomes one and the same with venom, when all that he once was shrinks into an insignificant pool of venomous slime, line 676, in minimum mors contrait omnia virus. It is now that Lucan inserts the shockingly nihilistic remark at the end of this passage that this disease opens up and lays bare whatever a human is, omne quid homo est aperit pestis. In Shadi Barsh's analysis, the loss of coordinates of what it means to be human beyond the flesh, and the challenge to the Cartesian ego that the revelation and disclosure of the abject, of the Christivan abject, brings, works as a larger philosophical frame to the paradoxical dissolution of differences that makes up the fabric of civil war. Because after all, bellum civile already indicates the inherently contradictory nature of a conflict that is by definition against external enemies, while bellum intestinum, that is an expression that Lucan, however, doesn't directly use, but he uses the metaphor, directs attention onto the disquieting presence of potentially unstable and disruptive bowels within the packaged metaphor of the body politic. Through the proliferation of paradoxes and boundary violations in bellum civile, dichotomous differences are stretched, questioned, and often subverted, alongside the dissolution of dichotomous dynamics, such as self versus other, or inside versus outside. So in this paper, I look specifically at the ways in which boundaries between human and animal and Roman and barbarian are blurred in the subtly ethnographic episode that concludes Cato's march through the desert, and which can be read as presenting the recomposition of the Republican body at the hands of an African people. These are the Psylli, ambiguously presented by Lucan as crossing the human and the animal, the scientific and the marvelous. But the episode also reflects upon the dichotomy between medicine and magic, which is a dichotomy and a distinction that the modern mind should be wary, however, of imposing onto the more fluid boundaries perceived by antiquity, where magicus means both magic and medical. But nevertheless, in this specific passage, it can be felt as a binary that emerges from a perceived tension between the natural and the supernatural. My reading, however, will mostly center on the political and show how the passage and its bodily and medical metaphors contribute to some of the most pressing questions of Lucan's poem. One such question, which lies at the heart specifically of Book 9, is the extent to which a resolution to the conflict should be found within or without the Roman body politic, once corruption has spread so contagiously among the Romans as to turn the Republic itself into a diseased body, not unlike that of Sabellus, threatening to collapse, and itself synonymous with Venum. The very structure of Book 9 simultaneously allows both external and internal anti-Roman and Roman forces to rescue the state from civil war. Because at the heart of Bellum Civile 9, Cato's struggle to recompose what is left of the Republican forces must be sustained by the Libyan land, which turns into a veritable landscape of allegory, in Mathieu's words, imaginatively uncorrupted and uncontaminated by Roman greed, onto which to test and rescue Cato's Stoic virtue. But the book's last movement, so the episode that comes just after the Psylli, transports us away instead to Phrygia, where Caesar is visiting Troy, namely the site of the most illustrious and non-civil war of history, and he's treading in the footsteps of Alexander the Great, so that very model that Cato rejected earlier in Book 9 when he refused to consult the oracle of Jupiter Ammon in imitation of Alexander. As also emphasized by Lucan in that episode with his abrupt apostrophe to his Caesar, this visit anticipates the reality of Caesar's victory and the instauration of the Caesars as the venomous remedy to the disease of civil war, one that will forever dissolve the old structures of the Roman Republic. So it is against, just closing my email. It is against this background the background of a search for neither allopathic or homeopathic remedy to civil war, that this paper will read the episode of the Psylli. So the Psylli are the Dei ex machina who rescue and heal the Republican army just before the scene is redirected onto Caesar, who is the real pharmacon of civil war. He is both the poison and the cure, and he is often presented by Lucan as synecdochic of the very energy and violence of the conflict, as if Caesar is civil war. At first glance, remedy comes from the outside, so it seems to come from an African people and a part wondrous one at that. But on closer inspection, we can see that reasons emerge for rejecting this ideologically driven and disingenuous portrait of a foreign people who actually proved to be connected to Rome and specifically to the corrupted Rome of the Caesars in ways that we would have never imagined, perhaps, not least in what Mollier and Jones Lewis has suggested is a certain cynical shrewdness of these doctors as it surfaces in other Roman sources. The entire passage can thus be read as the opposite of what Lucan initially presents us with. Not only are the Psylli not the ones who will have the final word in the poem on how the fractured Republican body can be recomposed, but Lucan's feigned ethnography in the supposedly uncontaminated tract of land ends up showing just how far Rome's contagion has spread throughout the known world. So Lucan develops the episode of the Psylli, and you should have a copy of the PowerPoint so you can go back and forth with the text and the bibliography if you like. So Lucan develops the episode of the Psylli by introducing an epic set scene of healing, as if we were stepping into a short ethnographic excursus of the kind able to elicit tauma. So I'm going to read the passage in English. Scarcely and late did fortune lend help to these desperate men, wearied by such mighty danger. A unique people lives in these lands, unharmed by the savage serpent's bite, the Psylli of Marmarica. Their tongue can compete with powerful herbs. Their blood itself keeps them safe, and in forbidding access to any venom, it is powerful, even if they stop chanting. The nature of the land bid them to live among the serpents, immune. They benefited from settling among the venoms. Death brought them peace. Now, although this will soon be corrected, as we will see, because we will find out later that the Psylli were actually accompanying Cato in the march, this passage makes it sound as if Cato and his men, finally aided by fortune, happened to step into the land of the local Psylli. The Psylli are presented as unique, unica, an adjective meant to elicit marvel, but also kind of ironic because it is not quite precise if we take it at face value, because they, as we will see, they share the same characteristics of other people, such as the Ophiogenes and the Marsi. They are both harmless, which is a meaning of innoxious, not the meaning here, but it is a meaning of innoxious, a line 892, and unharmed, which is what innoxia means in this line, immune as it's taken up by 896, immunes, they're immune to the snake's venom. So this is not due to technical expertise in medicine or sorcery, although they do have some of that expertise. They make use of common remedies against snake poison, such as herbs, which, however, they seem to use as prophylaxis rather than cure, as indicated in the catalogue of herbs that Lucan inserts later, that they use to keep the snakes away rather than to heal. They use incantation and sucking, as we will see, both activities later described in the healing scene and condensed here in the tongue, the lingua of line 893. But in this passage, they actually are immune to the serpent's venom because of a peculiar characteristic of their blood, which is presented as itself safe from venom in 894, tutus, and powerful, potens, in stopping it from flowing in, nullum admittere virus, whether or not they engage in singing, well, cantu cessante, so it doesn't matter if they use incantation or not. Now, Lucan's passage, I think, ambiguously plays with the reader's expectations and their potential hallucinations as it positions the Psylli in the realm of what Todorov famously called the uncanny, that is, a narrative space of liminal suspense, where the intimation of the fantastic via the presence of strange, uncanny events stirs the psyche of both readers and the main characters in such a way as to elicit primeval fears, but without discarding the possibility of a rational and scientific explanation, and thus without allowing the narrative to become fully wondrous. The Psylli's main characteristic, that is an immunity in the blood that they can pass on to future generations, is something that makes them potentially marvelous, despite its hiding from the human eye. And indeed, they are later labeled by Lucan, as we will see, as potential thaumaturgs, magical medical people able to perform miracles, magicae miracula gentis, where magicae is both magic and medical. Lucan's uncanny narrative always remains at the doorstep of the wonders, but that the Psylli may have been considered half bestial or marvelous as a kind of serpent people is actually confirmed by other sources. It is confirmed by Strabo, who possibly identifies as Psyllus, the originator of the Ophiogenes in Asia Minor, so literally the snake born, originally a serpent who had metamorphosed into a man. So he says that here in Parium is told the mythical story that the Ophiogenes are akin to the serpent tribe. And they say that the males cure snake-bitten people by continuous stroking after the manner of enchanters, first transferring the livid color to their own bodies and then stopping both the inflammation and the pain. According to the myth, the original founder of the tribe, a certain hero, changed from a serpent into a man. Perhaps, says Strabo, he was one of the Libyan Psylli, whose power persisted in this tribe for a certain time. So on the face of it, however, Lucan explains away the miraculous characteristic of the Psylli's blood with the help of pseudoscientific environmental determinism. So if we go back to the passage, you see that in Lucan, it is actually in line 895, it is actually the nature of the land, the natura locorum, that taught them to survive via immunity, as they acquired the characteristic of both the desert and its creatures. Now, the same explanation seems to imply in the only surviving fragment by Nicander that mentions the Psylli, and that is thought to derive from the Ophiaca. I have heard how the people of the Psylli do not at all suffer from the bloody bites of the beasts nurtured by the Syrtis, mother of sands, and well skilled are they to succor others when afflicted by such blows, not by means of herbs, but with their own limbs, skin to skin. Here, Nicander seems to introduce the Psylli as a matter of wondrous rumor and hearsay, the ekluon at the start of the passage, and as such, perhaps not to be believed. He also adds a very telling slippage, I think, between the serpents, which are the beasts theron in line 1, from whose bites the Psylli do not suffer, and the Psylli themselves, since it seems to me that the relative pronoun hus in line 3, the direct object of the Syrtis' nurturing, and generally translated by taking theron as antecedent, can in fact refer to either the beasts or the Psylli, or else to both of them simultaneously. Now, Lucan too had mentioned the snake's autochthony in the Libyan sands when describing how they sprung directly from the previously sterile soil, sterilis tellus, as the result of a perverted female-led impregnation. You can look at the verb concipiunt in line 698. So a perverted female-led impregnation with the semen-like venom that drips from Medusa's head, and that he calls the infernal dew of a savage blood, diros ferode sanguinerores. Now, unlike the snakes, Lucan's Psylli are clearly not native to the soil, but they seem to have assumed the land's characteristics by means of contiguity. So if you notice in the passage, he says that they are living on the land 892 incolit rather than originating from it. And later he mentions in 897 that they have settled here, sedem posuisse, so from somewhere else. Now, this is in line with other accounts of the Psylli as a people forced to move out of the region after being almost exterminated by the Nasamones, who took control of their territory, as you can see, for instance, in the first passage from Pliny that I'm not going to read. The paternity test performed by the Psylli on their children, which is described at some length later by Lucan, makes sense for a people who had been almost completely exterminated, and it shows Lucan mixing environmental theory with theories of heredity, as was often the case in Greco-Roman proto-racial thought. In our earliest reference to the Psylli, Herodotus paradoxically negated their existence as soon as he affirmed it, claiming that they are neighbors to the Nasamones, but that they have completely perished. This is a very strange passage. It says, "Eisi psylloi uto exapololasi." And then he goes on to say that they were all buried in the desert by the wind when marching to look for water. This part marvelous story, which Herodotus says was recounted to him by the Libyans themselves, lego de tauta ta legus Libyes, is likely to have attempted to supplant the reality of the Nasamones' mass slaughter. In Lucan, we find the Psylli possibly in the Syrtis, but we have this unparalleled observation that they originally were from Marmarica. He calls them Marmaridae Psylli, a region between Egypt and Cyrenaica, which would be highly disorienting if we had to take it as a geographical coordinate for Cato's current route, although this would not be the only geographical imprecision in Cato's route, because similar problems are also caused by his visit to Jupiter Ammon. Silius Italicus will transfer some of the Psylli's characteristics onto the inhabitants of Marmarica. So he will say that the Marmaridae are a magical folk, at whose singing the snake forgets her poison, and at whose touch the horned serpents lay tame. Whereas Pseudo-Democritus had written that the Psylli are found in those faraway places of Libya towards Cyrene. I'm not sure how to take this actually, Teskata, Kyrenen, which is a vague expression that seems to me more likely to refer to the Syrtis in any case than to Marmarica. Agatharchides of Cnidus apparently wrote that the tomb of King Psyllus, after whom the Psylli were named, could be found in the region, again, of the greater Syrtis. So it seems that in Lucan's passage, it's quite unique that they have moved from Marmarica to the Syrtis. It may be that the wondrous rumors about the Psylli, which turned them into a near mythical magical people, developed as news of their survival from what Herodotus had described as a complete extinction. At any rate, we can say that Lucan Psylli are an alloctonous people whose magical characteristic of being immune to the snake's poison has been acquired by contiguity with the snakes themselves and with the land of the Syrtes from which the serpents sprang, as if by a contagion originally caused by the blood dripping from the Gorgon's head. This is highlighted by the paradoxical sententia that closes their presentation by claiming how their ability to live in peace with the serpents was brought about by the deadly venom. That's the last line of the passage, pax lis cum morte datast, with mors being synonymous with venom, as in other passages of Book 9. So the Psylli's life becomes a life granted by death or a kind of survival in death. While representing in their own blood the very principle of immunity resulting from exposure to disease, the Psylli join both the snakes and the land of Libya in simultaneously posing a potential threat of contagion to the Romans, all the more so since it is by a similar kind of close contiguity that they are able to cure from snake bites. But after the Psylli's near ethnographic introduction, Lucan's narrative lingers on the snake trial that they perform on their babies to check their genuine paternity, and I haven't included that here, and also on a short catalogue of herbs, as I mentioned, that they burn to keep the snakes off the Roman camp. And then he introduces their healing abilities in the scene that I'm going to focus on, that is referred to by Lucan as the Psylli's great fight for dragging out the venom. So he writes that if someone bitten by day was risking his life, then such are the wonders of this magical people. Such is the Psylli's great fight for dragging out the venom. At first, the healer marks the affected limbs with a touch of his spittle, which holds the poison in check and confines the disease to the wound. Then he starts rolling out many songs with his foaming tongue in an unbroken muttering, for the speed of the infection does not let him take a breath, nor does the prospect of death permit a moment's silence. And often the plague sown into the blackened marrows flees away as if by incantation. But if the poison is slower to listen and fights back when summoned and ordered to leave, then he leans over the pale wounds and touches them with his lips, sucking up the venom into his mouth and draining the limbs with his teeth. Powerful in dragging out death from the icy cold body, he spits it out. And the kind of snake whose bite he has just conquered, the Psyllus can recognize, I find this very funny, but can recognize immediately by the taste of the poison. So this healing scene makes use of some technical medical vocabulary that I have highlighted in yellow for you there to make sense of these different colors. So you can see cohibet, sicat, extractam, which is actually stands for the more precise exugere. But overall, the passage wavers between a potentially ridiculed battle scene highlighted in blue and a spell scene highlighted in purple. So the battle scene, you can see fata trait, which includes one of Lucan's favorite verbs to indicate the ruinous process of civil war. And then ingens pugna, repugnat, potens, superaverit are all kind of fighting vocabulary. Whereas in terms of the spell scene, that would specifically call to mind here the necromancy of Erichto in Book 6 of the poem, also with echoes of Femonoe's ecstatic madness and muttering of her half-spoken prophecy in Book 5. And both Erichto and Femonoe, in their status as Wates, who deliver partially uttered prophecies of future history, have been read in various ways as doubles for the poet. So some trace of that may be present here too, perhaps, if the healing Psyllus can be interpreted metapoetically as the one collective force, and you can note that the healer is never explicitly named as a subject when appearing in the singular. So it's a kind of sort of collective force who recomposes the wounds of the Republican army and at the same time rounds off the narrative of Lucan's Libyan history by singing out the poison, we can say singing out the poison of civil war, the 931 ex cantata, with, again, and I'm kind of leading metapoetically, with a sort of continuous epic chanting, spumanti carmina lingua murmure continuo, a chanting that is able to bring this ice-cold Republican corpse back to life. Now, Lucan's choice of healing practices to attribute to the Psylli is rather telling in the scene. So if you notice the previously quoted fragment of Nicander in the last line specified that the Psylli didn't make use of herbs in healing others from snake bites, urizais erdontes, but they healed simply by virtue of their touch, heon da potion croaguion, which may explain why they are not included in Nicander's list of herbal remedies in the Seriaca. The same was apparently reported by Callias of Syracuse in his history of Agathocles, which we cannot exclude as a source for Nicander, who apparently claimed that the Psylli's remedies for snake bites consisted, in order of urgency, firstly in spitting on the wound, then in making the bitten man drink a cup of water with which one of the Psylli had previously rinsed his mouth, and finally, if neither of the previous methods worked, in lying naked beside the equally naked sick man, applying to him by friction the innate power of their skin. So both Nicander and Callias connect the Psylli's magical healing with the special immune qualities of their blood. And my point here is that, strangely, Lucan doesn't. Agatharchides of Cnidus apparently made their blood not just immune, but in turn poisonous to the snakes and able to affect them via a specific smell that would induce drowsiness in serpents. And a hint of this may also be retained by Lucan in the snake trial, when the genuine baby Psyllus is described as touching the snakes with no harm nor fear. But interestingly and surprisingly, after their almost marvelous introduction, Lucan chooses here to retain as little as possible of the Psylli's thaumaturgy in the healing scene. So the power of their magical touch, if at all present, is concealed in the ambiguous junctura tacta saliva in line 925. And there may be an echo of Callias's description in the, I think it's similarly erotic, image of the Psyllus lying upon the sick man and touching his pale wounds with his mouth in line 933. But despite these allusions and the possibly innate power of the Psylli's saliva, Lucan, in the main, seems to gloss over their potentially magical touch, and concentrates instead on their lingua, as he had already singled out in the presentation, in terms of its double ability of extracting the venom by both chanting and sucking it out from the diseased body. So Lucan figures the Psylli's healing of the Roman bodies as a process of extraction here, with emphasis on the dragging out of the poison, and I have highlighted it in bold. So rapti, ex cantata, elicitum, exire, traens, extractam, expuit. So it's all this dragging out of the poison from the body. So in Lucan's medical imagination, it seems that the poison can still be separated from the healthy parts of the body. It can be held in check and retained in the wound in line 926, coibet, retinet, even if the marrow has started to change color and rot. Now, this optimistic separation between healthy and diseased bodily tissues, when applied to the metaphor of the body politic, evinces Cato's attempt to heal the Republic by sucking out the poison of civil war, and that of those personalities such as Pompey and Caesar who hold Alexander-like monarchic aspirations. Cato himself had anticipated the healing Psyllus when explaining his scientific reasoning for drinking from the snake-infested water in the desert, on the basis precisely of a clear-cut separation between different parts of the body. As Cato reassured his soldiers, the snake's venom is only harmful when it mixes up with the blood. Noxia serpentest ad mixto sanguine pestis. And this doesn't happen by swallowing, but only by direct contact with an open wound. Although Cato's scientific knowledge enables him to survive the test of the pool, His excessive reliance on the impenetrability of the body may be dangerously reckless here, considering Celsus's caution to beware of sore places in the gums or the palate or other parts of the mouth when sucking out the venom out of a wound. Moreover, as I hope I showed at the start of this paper, the penetrability and vulnerability of the Republican masculine body will be literally laid bare in the following narrative of the march through the snakes, in such a way that makes us doubt to what extent Cato's clear-cut distinctions and his belief that the Republican body can be saved align with Lucan's near-apocalyptic dissolution of opposites and differences in this new rhetoric of his civil war. The Psylli's use of extraction, distinction, and separation in their healing practice comes uncomfortably close to an undermining ridicule, I think, at the end of the healing scene, where Lucan adds this otherwise unattested detail of the Psylli's ability to recognize the venom of each and every serpent by virtue of their taste. If we take the cold body, or is it perhaps already a corpse, that the Psyllus attempts to reanimate as synecdochic of the whole political body of the Republic, then the healing scene, when read together with the Psylli's introduction, may be interpreted as summing up in a nutshell the entire question of Lucan's civil war, which is namely, what kind of disease is civil war? Is it the kind that can be healed by extraction, like a cancer operated by a surgeon before it spreads throughout the body? Or should it rather be overcome by immunity via exposure? We're used to hearing about this quite a lot lately. Just like the blood immunity that the Psylli obtained by close contact with the serpents. And doesn't such immunity to the disease by the production of antibodies come at the price of transformation, so that the Republic may be healed by turning into a body that in its immunity is therefore different from what it was before? So these are precisely the questions, I think, and the tensions that Lucan may be hinting at by juxtaposing the Psylli's wondrous herd blood immunity, which makes them a kind of serpent-like people, with their technical medical skills paraded in the healing scene. And then again in juxtaposing this healing scene with Caesar's visit to Troy in the footsteps of Alexander the Great. And what these juxtapositions bring to light is the contrast, I think, between Cato's and Caesar's political solutions as contrasting remedies for and contrasting conceptions of the body politic. So Cato hopes to eradicate civil war and restore the Republic to its pre-Civil War greatness, while Caesar Alexander anticipates, in the hindsight of Lucan's readers at least, the Republic's transformation into a near monarchic one-man rule. And directly related to Cato's vision of healing the Republic from the disease of civil war is the question of the origin and the ethnicity of the Psylli as a non-Roman people providing external help to a self-afflicted citizen body on a non-Roman territory. Yet, I think that Lucan shows Cato as delusional also in this specific aspect, and that this bears on the wider political irony expressed by the poet on the feasibility of Cato's medico-political plan. So far, I have argued that Lucan sets up the Psylli as a potentially magic thaumaturgic people, only to have his healing scene negate that uncanny feeling of stepping into a narrative of wonder. For here, there is nothing wondrous, actually, about the Psylli's healing practices. And unlike other accounts of them in different authors, as we have seen, the Psylli's supposed blood immunity to the snake's poison plays no role in the effectiveness of their practices. Now, this is what we read, and what Lucan may also have read, I think, in Celsus, who denies the Psylli's special nature by means of arguments that recall those of Cato when drinking from the snake-infested pool. Now, Celsus vehemently refuses the notion that the Psylli have a distinguished scientific skill, a scientia praecipua, let alone that they are magical. Rather, he says, they have boldness confirmed by experience, audacia usu ipso confirmata. Precisely because the serpent's poison is harmless if swallowed, unless, as we have seen, it enters the circulatory system via sore place in the mouth, It is safe for anyone to follow the example of the Psylli and to suck out the wound, a practice that Celsus believes will help save the patient. So he writes, ergo quisquis exemplum Psylli secutus id vulnus exuxerit et ipse tutus erit et tutum hominem praestabit. In a relatively recent chapter on the historical presence of the Psylli in the Roman imperial world, Molly-Ann Jones-Lewis, sorry, I didn't give you the passage of Celsus, I think. This was the passage of Celsus, boldness confirmed by experience. So anyone can follow the example of the Psylli. So Molly-Ann Jones-Lewis argues persuasively that they may have shrewdly built a medical career upon the rumors that circulated about them. She points out the rarity of actually dying from snake bite and the effectiveness of some of these interventions, not just sucking, but also chanting, which would have encouraged patients to stay still and relax, thereby slowing down the spread of venom in the body. And she suggests that the Psylli capitalized on their thaumaturgic reputation by taking credit for saving patients who would have survived snake bites in any case. And she finds compelling evidence that the Romans at least suspected a certain deceitfulness and untrustworthiness on the part of the Psylli in the elder Pliny's casting them as some sort of first-century bioterrorists importing scorpions and other foreign poisons to Italy in the hope of profiting from them. So he writes that the Psylli tribe, by importing the poisons of all the other countries for their own profit, have filled Italy with foreign evils, have tried to bring these creatures, and he's talking about scorpions here also. What is left out of this analysis, however, is the possible degree of xenophobia or mistrust applied to a foreign African people who was perhaps already imagined as deceitful in the 1st century BCE. If we want to interpret the label, if we want to interpret as a xenophobic slur, the label Punic, Poenus, that the poet Cinna seems to have attached to Apsillus lulling a serpent to sleep. We don't really know much about this. We only have this fragment, somniculosam ut Poenus aspidem psillus. We don't even have the verb. So I have argued elsewhere that in the Roman imagination, and specifically in Lucan, such xenophobia or distrust of Africa as violently savage is tightly linked and codependent with Africa's simultaneous idealization as utopically primitive in ways that anticipates racist early modern European conceptions of the continent. In Bellum Civile 9, Africa functions both as a land of potentially monstrous savagery, exemplified by the snakes and by their origin story, and as a frugal anti-Rome against which Cato has to test his own incorruptibility through a march that becomes a symbolic expiation of Rome's collective civil war guilt. Apollonius of Rhodes in the Argonautica had already provided the screenplay for Lucan's Libya as a deserted landscape of shifting and potentially wondrous, but also potentially dangerous mirages. Lucan combines this epic vision of a site ripe for Greek colonization with a very Roman and specifically Sallustian idea of Africa as an imagined other from which to observe and reflect upon the late Republican crisis. Lucan follows closely, I think, Sallus Bellum Jugurthinum in its focalization of the greed and corruption of the Roman aristocracy from the viewpoint of Numidia, as well as Sallust's obsession that Rome needs Africa and more generally external enemies onto which to direct the violence that will otherwise tear apart its own citizen body. And this is why it makes sense, I think, for Lucan that the expiation of the sins of civil war should take place in Africa, and that the Deus ex machina of Cato's army, so those who save and recompose the Republican army, not just from the snakes, but from the contagious poison of civil war, which broke down the Roman body in such a way as to confound basic opposites, such as enemy-friend or inside-outside, healthy or diseased, should come from Africa. And that Lucan needed the African Psylli rather than an Italian people to provide a cure to this disease is clear by his decision to sidestep the Italian Marsi, who were actually known to have the very same immunity to the snake poison and the same ability to fight it off in others. And Lucan doesn't just ignore or neglect the Marsi's power, but he explicitly disproves it by making Nasidius, a cultivator of a martian field, he calls him Marsi cultorem agri, explode like a boiling cauldron under the heating effect of a prester on his definitively not immune blood. It is then doubly surprising to learn that the Psylli in Lucan's scene may not actually come from Africa after Lucan had them introduced in such a way as to make us suspect that they do. Only after the Psylli have been introduced, and Lucan has gone on to explain how they subject their offspring to the danger of the snakes in order to affirm their patrilineal inheriting of the blood immunity. So only after all of this do we actually discover that they had been accompanying Cato and the Roman standards all along. And these are lines 911 to 12, qui tum Romana secutus signas, the Psyllus. The same is reported by Plutarch, who writes explicitly that Cato took them with him on his journey. And we read in both Cassius Dio and Suetonius that Augustus employed Psylli to try and save Cleopatra from the venom of the aspis. Whether or not they were mentioned by Livy in either of these contexts, so in book 112 or 133, must remain pure speculation. But what is interesting for our purposes is that these people that Lucan had presented in exotic terms as the semi-marvelous African folk coming from outside the Roman world to extract the poison from the Republican body of Cato's army and recompose and save what is left of the Republic are actually, in the empire's global terms, as Roman as they can be. And they contribute to proving that Rome's corruption has extended throughout the known world. We know it has extended to Egypt, as the deceitful murder of Pompey in Bellum Civilen 8 has just demonstrated, and even to Africa, where these self-appointed thaumaturgs have turned racial slander and malicious hearsay into profit. Because if they were not part of the globalized world of the Roman Empire, how else would they have acquired such exotic magical herbs as the Syrian galbanum peregrina in 916, peregrina galbana, or the Indian costos, eoa costos, or the horns of deer, whose birthplace, Lucan himself says, was far from Africa, longe nascentis cornua cervi. And these are herbs which, by the way, they do not even know how to use for healing purposes. They limit themselves to burning, to a kind of showmanship. So in conclusion, Lucan gestures towards a presentation of the Psylli as the magico-medical dei ex machina who extract the serpent's venom from the almost deceased bodies of Cato's soldiers by evoking the image of a foreign nation that symbolically extracts the poison of civil war from the marrows of the Roman Republic. Close analysis, however, reveals that and how the passage undermines and subverts this reading by presenting us with the disquieting realization that in the superimposition of Nero's times onto the times of Cato's march through the desert, Rome's corrupting greed has reached the very farthest place of the empire. In a rather striking simile for a snake-like people, the Psylli who test the blood of their offspring are compared to eagles, utque Jovis volucer, the very symbol of the Roman legions found in the opening of Lucan's poem as fighting against each other. And the baby Psyllus, who confirms faithfulness to the line by playing with the snakes in line 908, si quis donatis lucit serpentibus infans, this baby Psyllus may well evoke the exemplary imperialists, Alexander, the elder Scipio, and Caesar Augustus, each of whose mothers were said to have had intercourse with a snake. In the very imagery of their bloodline, the Psylli thus end up evoking the very opposite of what they initially seemed to stand for. They seem to evoke instead the inevitability of Caesar and of the Caesars as the only remedy to civil war, namely that one remedy that will put an end to the conflict, not by eradicating it, but by turning it into a permanent and immanent condition, which is naturally also the condition that permits or dooms the Roman future to continue battling to recover itself from the ideology of inevitability. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think you have the, sorry, maybe I can just stop sharing.
All right, thank you very much indeed, Elena, for this very rich paper, which I'm sure gives us very many things to discuss. There were so many really intriguing points in there. But in order for us to do this nicely and fortified with a nice drink, let's follow our good old custom and take a 5-minute break to refill our glasses, and then we'll be back for the discussion. Time to get going again. So we'll see if some more people reappear in person on the screen. even if that's not the case, we can probably get started again. Free to raise an actual physical hand or to raise an electronic hand. Yeah, who wants to ask the first question? Yeah, Joe, please.
Hello, sorry. Hello, Elena. Thank you for a wonderful paper. I'm not a Latinist, obviously, and this is far outside my area of expertise. But I was really interested in the kind of the ethnographic, and you were hinting at the kind of racial connotations lurking behind the language that's used. And I'd just be interested to hear more about that in terms of the contemporary poetry and how widespread do you think that was as at that point in time in Republican literature? And is it something that's completely, is it endemic to Roman society, or is it a kind of an elite view, or is it linked to kind of slavery, other sort of aspects, or is it very restricted to this kind of quite elite literature and audience?
Thank you so much. That's a great question to which I have no answer. I think it's very much partly of what I'm trying to figure out, and also like just trying to figure out if we can take various representations of Africa together and if they can amount to, we can say, some sort of proto-race. What I'm interested in is this continuity between these texts and early modern texts that will actually use these texts, and will actually use, especially, I look especially at Pliny or Pomponius Mela, but I think that Lucan and Sallust also play a big part in that, to construct what we know are actually, when we can properly tell, racist conceptualizations of people in Africa. So, because I think that the question is, what is then the difference between xenophobia or othering and racism, right? I think with racism, and it depends on the definition that you use, you probably know this better than me anyway, but the definition that I would use for racism implies a sort of unmovable structural distinction, which also implies or justifies oppression, right? So it's not just recognizing difference. And I don't think that you necessarily need to have theories of heredity in it, as some actually thought, because I think Benjamin Isaac, for instance, said that the point is that if you know, in antiquity, if you move, when you have environmental determinism, then if the fact that if you move, you can potentially get out of your stereotypical traits. I don't think that's a good point for actually claiming that, you know, you especially, I look especially at Carthaginians, and I do think that there is something that we can recognize as racism for Carthaginians, for instance. With the Psylli, I actually don't know, because I don't know how much they were known at all. And I think this is the question that you pose is really important. In Latin, they appear here in Lucan. They seem, I don't know how much they would. Lucan is quite, in many ways, I think he's a very Hellenistic author. He looks for researched things. I mean, the whole catalog of the snakes, all that we can say, I think, is that is clearly very much indebted to Nicander. And I think he writes in that vein. And it could be that, and also the list of African people that he inserts in book 4 has a number of very researched people that we don't find in Sallust, and it emphasized the plurality, which is in line with this kind of catalog, Hellenistic catalogs. So I don't know how much the Psylli would have been surprising. As I said, they do appear in other accounts of Cato's march, but they appear more as people that the Romans could use. So this idea also that this anecdote that Octavian wanted to use them to save Cleopatra is interesting, I think. But I don't know how widespread knowledge about the Psylli would have been. for Lucan's readers in Neronian times, and I have no idea before then either. So I'm a bit lost there.
Well, thank you. That was great.
I have a question that actually ties in with that, and that has always bothered me a bit when reading Lucan. To what extent is it actually still meaningful to speak of, well, distinctions between Rome and other, because these are blurred throughout, really? Is this still a meaningful criterion when reading and analyzing Lucan?
I think it is. I think it is, because he makes it, and he confuses it continuously, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he, and that's part of his kind of undermining it, but he makes it a meaningful criteria in the mouth of his characters. So it's as if there's this delusional ideology that that characters believe in. So I'm thinking of, sorry, I don't remember, it's not Lentulus, the I think it's the steersman who accompanies Pompey in book 8, right? And so before Pompey decides to go to Egypt, which is, you know, even more treacherous, but he wants to go to Parthia, and he's told, you know, that would be the very nemesis, like a Roman turning to Parthia. So it's just undoable. And he's clearly writing, I mean, we don't know what Asinius Pollio would have had, but I think he's clearly, from what we can say, he's clearly reusing a rhetoric that we find in Sallust and that we find in Horace's Epodes 7, 9, and 16, but also I think of Horace's Pollio Ode 2:1. So he's clearly, I think, writing in that vein. He's talking about the death of Scipio Metellus as a retaliation 100 years later for Carthage, so the offer of a Scipio. So he clearly, I think, writes in this rhetoric. So I very much follow. I think it's mostly Friedrich Ahl who was the first probably to have a long discussion on this, I think. So I do follow that, but I think with the Psylli, it's exactly what you are saying. It's so what I wanted to say is that he sets, you know, this idea as if Cato still believes in this idea that there are that there is a distinction between Romans and non-Romans. So we arrive among the Psylli, and it looks like they are this African people, and it looks like they come from there. And there's this when you read the passage, like, you know, swiftly, you don't even realize that they came with Cato all along. And then you find that actually there's all these things that make them actually Roman. So I think he's, as you say, he's actually subverting that. Yeah, so it makes sense. So the division is there, but it's there to be problematized.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Further questions? Feel free to type them in the chat as well if you like. Any further questions or comments? Yes, Claire.
I'm sort of still trying to articulate. Oh, hi, Elena. Sorry. It's lovely to see you, albeit virtually. So I'm not going to articulate this very well yet, because I'm still sort of trying to formulate it. But I thought I'd jump in there, you know, rather than leave the uncomfortable silence and try and articulate as I go, because I'm very picking up on Anka's point. I'm really fascinated with the work that you do with the other, as you know, because this is something we've talked about in the past, and with the fear of the enemy. And I'm just struck with the idea of the role that, so the idea of Augustan peace and extending peace, and the idea of Roman peace, and what comes with that. And in terms of subduing, so if your enemy is not your enemy anymore because they become pseudo-Roman, as it were, pseudo-other, then what are the ramifications for peace and how you achieve peace if you ultimately have no enemy left to fight to then achieve peace? And how does that fit into civil war? Is that articulate enough, or should I take some more time to think about that?
No, I think it's exactly the point. I mean, that is the point that I was trying to make, I think, with my book. No, in a sense, because what I took the Carthaginians in the Augustan times as setting them up as an enemy, but then also texts that are very much playing with this fiction of the enemy. They're always they're exposing that fiction in order to yeah, to show just, you know, the mirage that it is, that the distinction that it is. So, and the point of, you know, that for me, that is related to the fact that, yeah, the Augustan piece is a mirage. I mean, we know that conspiracies, that is why I'm interested in conspiracies now. It looks like I'm interested in many different things, but I think in my head, like they all coalesce in some way. But we know that conspiracies continue, and as much as we have this use of external enemies in the Augustan texts to highlight the presence of peace within, yeah, the body politic, then I think that the texts themselves hint that is a mirage. So that is how I take, and so that's what I'm kind of continuing to read here in Lucan, I think. But yeah, that's what I was thinking about, this, you know, this ideology of inevitability, that it's just inevitable that civil war returns or is always there. There is no remedy coming from the outside extracting this evil and curing the body. And for me, that, you know, that is the mirage that the Psylli may represent, and it's the mirage that Cato may have, and that's why I saw his kind of belief that you can clearly divide things as the reason for his failure. But I don't know if I hope it makes some sense.
I think you made a lot more sense than me. Thank you very much.
I have Christopher Starr next.
Yes, hi, thank you. Greetings from the globalized, from the United States. Thanks, that was a great paper. I really just have really a comment or a thought, and was wondering what you might think. How much do you think that this idea of what we think is outside is not really outside sort of happens a lot, right? Especially in the later books, I was thinking, because I thought it was good that I wanted to sort of build on what Pompey says. He says, well, I'll go to the east and the Parthians, right, can conquer us. So on the one hand, he says the Orbis Romanus is lost to us, but maybe we can use Parthia, maybe we can use other places. But then at the same time, he says, well, my fame is already spread there anyway. So it's really just a comment, or to formulate as a question, do you see this trend of sort of saying, okay, we have this exotic non-Roman world, and then sort of, do you see Lucan doing this again and saying, well, actually, you know, really Rome is everywhere, that we can't sort of separate these? And I think I sort of see that perhaps happening with Pompey, where he says, we'll go to Parthia, it's a totally different world, but then he says, well, everybody knows me there anyway, so they're going to come to my aid. And then two, sort of bringing, I liked how you brought in sort of the Neronian world mapped onto this, right? We have Julius Caesar saying, well, wouldn't it be great if I found the source of the Nile? And Nero, right, is doing the same thing, right? And, you know, who knows why? Seneca says it's because he loves truth, but Pliny says it's because he wanted to conquer it and conquer Ethiopia. So I guess basically just my thought is, I thought this was a great paper, and I think it hones in well with that specific point. I was wondering if you saw any larger, this trend happening elsewhere in the epic.
Yeah, absolutely. So that passage by Pompey, I think, is yeah, I think it's the same that I was thinking about before at the beginning of book 8. So to the idea of Pompey already being there, and Parthia, I think, is such an important one, because it's the one that always recurs in Horace and Virgil as, you know, the potential other against which to direct, in imitation, I think, of Hellas, obviously. So the Parthians as heirs to the Persians. But I think that book 10 would be an obvious to look at when you come to Cleopatra's the whole luxury of Cleopatra. And Lucan tells us, I don't remember exactly how it is now, but Lucan tells us explicitly that you know, the problem there is actually Caesar. It seems like it is Caesar who is making this palace Egyptian in a sense. And I think that so the corruption that is brought in there, it's and that's the way I think it comes from our anachronistic reading of kind of Neronian reading of the text on top of that. But no, the passage of the sources of the Nile also obviously is really interesting, and Nero looking for Dido's treasure, and this idea that he can even find things, kind of stretch to places that no one knew where they existed. I don't know if he ever mentioned, I don't remember if he ever mentioned, because the other ones would be like Chinese and Indians that are sometimes mentioned by so Horace and Virgil as to map the contours of the globe. And I don't remember what Lucan, if he mentioned something what Lucan does with them, it would be interesting to see. It would also be interesting perhaps to think about the map of Agrippa, and that is something that I wanted to think about more, and how that, because that is a visual representation, right, of the world that clearly, who knows, right, if it's influenced by or influences the literary sources. But once you have a visual representation like that, that would be in the mind of the readers, and it would be interesting to kind of see how Lucan stretches that. But I don't think that Chinese and Indians, for instance, play the same role as the Parthians play in those texts.
Or he does, sorry, if I could just, he does say we should have conquered, right, Ceres, we should have conquered China first, right, at the very beginning.
Does at
and then turned to civil war, right? He says, right,
Yeah.
there was more. So I think that's in some ways interesting, right, too, sorry, that he sort of once admits there's a non-Roman world, but I basically just to say, I think you're right, there's a non-Roman world, but yet everything is Roman at the same time. I think he seems to be playing with that.
Yeah. I mean, there's also a paper by Erika Bexley, which is slightly different though, because that is Rome that is portable elsewhere, which is, I guess, the other side of the coin. I suppose that's the dislocation of Rome. So it's a different way of seeing it, I suppose, rather than roaming, globing. It's slightly different, I suppose. So it's where affects are, and yeah, thank you so much.
Questions or comments?
I have another silly question, potentially. Sorry, it's a bit tangential. The passage of Celsus, the 527. I'm not familiar with the author or the context, and I just saw that, and Audaciam, the stuff, as is that, does that carry kind of ethnographic kind of inflections? Is it as a kind of sort of barbaric trait? Because I'd vague memories of, doesn't it, Gauls and Germans are labeled as such, or is it just, sorry, there's a Yorkshire Terrier by my ankles that's making a noise. Is it meant to be kind of pejorative in the sense of identifying them as barbarian, or just, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Sorry.
Thank you. I hadn't thought about that. I mean, it's definitely derogatory here. I think I should just look at, I mean, it's interesting that he mentions the Gauls straight after that. It's also interesting how I qui Psylli nominantur, right? Those who are called Psylli, that I don't know, it's kind of, I don't know if that kind of contributes to the exoticization of them, but I think Audacia can, it can be used for, obviously, for Romans as well. It doesn't need to be used for non-Roman people, but I think you may be right that in this particular case, it's a daring. It seems like it's a daring that they have, that they claim to be thaumaturgs, and they're not, and that's why I think it's interesting that perhaps if they, as other African people, they seem to be assigned the stereotype of deceitfulness that, I mean, originally it's Carthaginian, but then we see it applied to Numidians, to the Maori. So especially in Sallust, so it's a stereotype that then gets applied to other African people as well. And again, we don't know anything about that fragment by Sinna, but the Psilus is called Poenus, right? So it's called Punic, so perhaps deceitful. So that's how I would take that boldness there in terms of their deceitfulness. But thank you. Yeah, but I don't know about the specific term, Audacia.
Thank you.
I also have a question or a comment. There's one part of the Ballonqueville that I was thinking of a lot during your paper, Elena, and that is the story of Hercules and Antaius, where the land too is so important, and the question, can you trust the land? To what extent is the land itself actually an actor in the story? And again, of course, the question of Rome and the other comes up a lot in there. How would you see the relationship of these two passages?
Yeah, I haven't. That's really interesting, because then it becomes the snake of Regulus, right? In Psylli.
Yeah.
So, and the snake,
Right,
already in the passage of, I think what Silius takes is the river, is it the Magrada river? That's Serpentem, that is just going like a snake, and that it becomes actually a snake whereas here we have Antaeus as the personification of the land. I have been teaching that passage, but I haven't connected it to the Psylli. I was looking at it more in terms of the violence of the civilizing hero. And obviously it's in many ways a rewriting of the Hercules and Cacus in the Aeneid. So it's interesting that Hercules also here shares many traits with Antaeus, right? So again, for looking at kind of mirroring images. And so I was interested in that, and I was also interested in its, I don't remember exactly how, but I always saw it, I connected it to Hercules in the Garden of the Hesperides in Apollonius, where again we have this sort of barbarous Hercules, right, who destroys rather than civilizes. And straight after that, then we have the whole narrative of Juba, and Juba himself is described as sorry, it's the English. Sorry, as an animal, the mongoose. So there's a simile between Juba and the mongoose, and it's really interesting because the Romans there become the serpents. So Juba gives an ambush like the mongoose to the Romans, who have become the serpents there. So I was very interested in the way that animal imagery is used in book 4 as a background kind of to this, but I haven't really gotten there yet. So I wouldn't know exactly how to link all of this, but I definitely wanted to look at just our Lucan presentation of Africa as a whole, as this sort of, again, this kind of double, it's also mirror for the Romans. So on the one hand, this place where, well, for Cato, he can kind of test his virtue, and it looks like a remedy to the civil war, but then it's also a mirroring. It also works as a mirror, if it makes sense.
Yes, yeah, totally.
And also book 4 is interesting because it's a book, it's already like a book of a character who has changed, right, from Pompeian to Caesarean cause, which is an interesting start, I think, for the book in terms of, and Juba himself is a very Romanized, incredibly Romanized character, obviously. So those were the things that I was interested in looking at.
Yeah.
But if you have other suggestions, I'm very happy to hear.
No, you already gave me very many more things to think about in this Herculean context there. This is great. Thank you. Further questions or comments? Is there anything else at all that people would like to raise? As I said, feel free to type something in the chat if you like, or raise a physical or an electronic hand.
Can I have another question? Sorry. Risk of hogging.
Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Sorry, Elena, this is very opportunistic, but I was just thinking in terms of your work on decolonizing and still designing, particularly the Africa course. I was be interested in here and your thoughts on how you present this material to students and the extent to which is it possible to kind of flip some of this material and rather than focusing on the kind of representations of Africa, which end up kind of perpetuating a discourse, of representation, or whether it's possible to, so open up new avenues that students will actually be able to engage with, realistically, say undergraduate level or postgrad level. And I don't know, I'd just be interested to hear anything, how you found teaching this kind of material, if you've been doing it to students at Warwick.
Yeah, thanks. It's been really hard, precisely for the reasons that you claim. I haven't taught the Psylli, but I did teach a bit of Lucan. It was just in one class. So I did a year-long module, and the first term we looked at representations in Greek and Roman texts. So Lucan got one lecture. I don't know how much they got out of that. But last year, some of the students doing it in Latin were reading a section of book 4, and I'm very interested in the plurality of people. So it's that passage, this list of African people that Lucan inserts, and I kind of stress the importance of so on the one hand, obviously there is a list and there is a sense that it is flattened, but on the other hand we get very particular representations for all of them. And for me, that within the text is one possible way out of this, because if you read what is interesting, not naming obviously the scholarship, but I have found in the scholarship sometimes different African people in Lucan confused, which it's very easy to do. And partly you can say, okay, well, maybe it is the text, that flattens African people as all the same, but also it isn't. Also, it is something that I think in our, like, it's part of the history of scholarship. So I tried to, so this is like to say that in the bigger, so sorry, I don't know how to take this. So I did the first term on this, and then the second term I did partly on authors writing in Africa or African authors. So we read kind of Hellenistic literature, like Seeing Double with Susan Stevens, that kind of thing. And then we read Apuleius is great in this respect, because it's an amazing author to use for kind of recovering African voices, but also in part sort of almost inferiority complex and the whole relationship he has with Greek and Latin texts. And then we went into reception, which I thought was hoping would kind of help think about the very problems of representations that these texts have. So I'm quite uncomfortable with the idea that we can take people like the Psylli or even Dido, and just, okay, we can recover them, or we can make them speak. I prefer to present to the students the difficulty of doing this when you have sources that do represent and objectify not just people but also landscapes. I talked a lot about land. I think Firoz Bazunia's The Gift of the Nile is really useful, I think, for that, of thinking how changes in representations of the landscape are always kind of ideologically driven. So I mean, and the whole kind of Orientalist discourse is something that they respond to quite well, as well as, you know, the question of Spivak, as you know, whether the subalterns can speak. They find it difficult to read, obviously, that text, but Victoria Ball did a really good job, I think, on applying it to the supplicas of Aeschylus. So it's really interesting to look at that from that perspective. So one thing, so just, yeah, to keep this short, so one thing is, like, I think in Lucan in particular, is this flattening of African people that I was very uncomfortable with. And a lot of it is also that I would like to teach them to look at the history of scholarship, and, like, just to, you know, not just to find out how we scholars, and all of us do it, because we're kind of building up on, you know, just certain things just get handed over. So how we have our own blind spots, and the scholars, you know, normally have their blind spots, and how we can see them and highlight them, rather than necessarily recover. Although, you know, there are articles that obviously try to recover. We can try to recover Giusti, and if you have a more, you know, I don't have a very, I didn't do an historical course, but you could recover Giusti, obviously, behind Sallust's presentation as, you know, as a rebel leader of the Numidians, and kind of work against Sallust's presentation. And you can say that the literature, you know, is a hindrance to that. But I think that the literature is interesting because it shows us, and looking at the literature for me with the student kind of shows those strategies of representations and those pitfalls. But also sometimes I think that the literature highlights these very problems of its own fiction. So I hope that this answers this a little bit, because normally the problem that I had is doing a course on decolonization on Africa works very well with history and culture, and it doesn't work very well with the literature, because, and then, you know, that all, you know, lots of the decolonizing discourse and classics and democratizing discourses, classics also sees, you know, the use of more material culture, for instance, or, you know, less importance given to reading these texts in the original languages. So I was just wondering how you do it, actually, with just having emphasis on the literature itself. It is absolutely doable, I think.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, it was a very long answer.
That was great.
Right, any further questions? Well, if it is not the case that anyone has any questions or comments, you notice I'm giving you a few seconds of more time here to say anything if you like. But if that is not the case, we should thank our speaker very much indeed with an actual or a virtual applause for a wonderful and thought-provoking paper and an equally wonderful discussion, which has opened, well, answered very many questions, but also opened up very many other questions. So this was really fascinating. Thank you so much, Elena, for being here tonight. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for asking questions and being part of this discussion. And see you all next week. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.